So often those chants are juxtaposed right before we meditate. The world is swept away. This body is filled with all sorts of unclean things, and then we say, "May I be happy." It's to make you stop and think, where does true happiness lie? Where does a safe and secure happiness lie? This is the big question we have to ask ourselves, because everybody wants happiness. As the Buddha said, all things, all phenomena that you can experience are rooted in desire. And what's the desire? The desire is the desire for happiness. The body, events in the mind, they all come from our desire for happiness. And then we act on that desire, sometimes in skillful and sometimes in unskillful ways. And so that's why the situation we're living in is a mixed bag in terms of being satisfactory or not. And so you have to look carefully at your actions to see which ones really are conducive to happiness and which ones are not. We can't rest secure in the notion there's somebody out there taking care of everything. It's all going to turn out all right in the end. Because we're the ones who are shaping our experience. And if we're not careful, we're going to shape things in an unskillful way. The Buddha saw all our activities are aimed at happiness. And what was especially interesting, he saw how much of what we experience is an activity. Even our sense of self, who we are, that's an activity. It's a fabrication. We decide to identify with certain things. And the thought that I am, the thought of identification, is putting things together. It's a fabrication. It's an activity aimed at happiness. And to some extent it's skillful. People who have a very poorly formed sense of self have trouble managing their lives. There's a certain level of identification that's needed, a certain sense of self that's needed just to function properly. And so in learning to be more skillful, the Buddha has us take that sense of self and try to make it more coherent. It's taking seriously your desire for true happiness, a happiness that lasts. And then asking yourself, well, what am I doing that's actually leading in that direction? What am I doing that's leading in the other direction? So maintaining that sense of what's in Pali called shame and fear of evil. In other words, shame at the idea of doing something that you know would be harmful, and then fear of the consequences of doing things that you know would be harmful. This type of fear, the Buddha said, is a useful kind of fear. This is what keeps us on the path. And it requires a certain sense of self, a certain sense of self-esteem, and the opposite of apathy. Realizing that what you do is important and it's going to have consequences down the line, and you don't want to suffer the consequences of unskillfulness. This is what keeps you on path. The sense that there are dangers out there, and the dangers lie in your unskillful actions. But it also implies trust, the trust that you can do things the proper way, and your trust in the principle that your actions really do matter. Now, the quest for happiness is a good quest, if you do it properly. If you take your quest for happiness seriously, the Buddha says you actually end up developing qualities that might seem that are the opposite of selfishness. Because you realize that if your happiness depends on the suffering of other people, well, they want happiness too. They're not going to just sit around and allow you to maintain that happiness. It's going to get destroyed. So if you're really sincere about happiness, you also want to develop the quality of compassion, taking the happiness of other people into account. And if you're wise, you'll look for a happiness that is secure, rather than just simply what you can grab at any moment. So the sign of a wise person is realizing that sometimes the things you would like to do are going to cause suffering, and the things you don't like to do are going to cause happiness. And it's a measure of your wisdom to realize that and act accordingly. In other words, our awareness of the whole causal principle really hits us because we realize it's going to affect our happiness. And that way we get wiser and wiser about causes and effects. And as he told his son Rahula, he'd really paying careful attention to your actions and their results, and resolving not to repeat mistakes in terms of actions that cause suffering for yourself or for other people. He said, this is how people attain purity. So compassion, wisdom, and purity, the qualities we associate with the Buddha, come from taking your quest for happiness seriously. Good things come from this sense of self that wants to find a long-term happiness. Ultimately, as we all know, though, that the Buddha also teaches not self. In other words, showing us that the things we tend to identify with can get in the way of an even higher level of happiness. But always keep in mind that it's that quest for happiness that lies in the background. That's the overriding issue. It's only when you become skillful in the way you manage your happiness in your life, realizing that being generous, being virtuous, training the mind are things that you have to do. You're responsible for your happiness. You have to develop these qualities that are harmless both to yourself and to others. Once you've got that principle firmly in mind, then you can start turning to the teaching on not self, in which you see that the various things you identify with leave you open to all kinds of dangers. If you identify with things that are impermanent, things that can be changed by causal conditions that are outside of your control, you're putting yourself in a position of weakness. And this is where the teaching on not self comes in. John Mahabharata compares it to a stick that you use to hit the hand of a monkey that's reaching out for things that it shouldn't reach for. Or for warning to yourself. If you reach into fire, it's going to be bad for you, so you have to slap your hand away from the fire. So many people resist the teaching on not self and all the teachings that are preparatory for that, like the chant we had just now on the body. It's there to remind you, if you really latch onto the body as yours in a really strong sense, you're going to suffer. If you can see it as a tool that you use towards happiness, okay, that's a different issue. But so many of us don't see it just in that way. It's us, it's ours. And of course, what happens to the body? It gets old, it gets sick in all sorts of horrible ways.